Hello. Thank you for joining me, and thank you to the Henry Moore Institute for the invitation to share my research. What I will talk about today is really a new project for me, and one that remains riddled with unresolved questions, but also potential trajectories. In this regard, I'm also very excited about the live question and answer session that will be hosted by the HMI on June 16th, and I hope that many of you will be able to participate in that as well. Okay, let me get right to it. All in the same boat, migratory passages in contemporary sculpture. Once bold and bright paint colors, now bleached by the sun, a pile of splintered wooden boats lays in tatters atop arid earth. Shades of blue cross the composition and sync with the cloudless azure sky above. Crimson red cuts through the scene unevenly. These huddling vessels are in varying states of distress, and smaller crafts peek out from under heavier hulls as their smashed collective rests in the foreground of a rocky slope. For more than a decade, this scene, entitled Shipwreck, Sculpture for the New Millennium, 2007, by the artist Isaac Julian, has been shown in numerous exhibitions globally. This photograph and others from Julian's series feature striking seascapes and wrecked, yet somehow nevertheless entrancing, boats smashed ashore. The absence of people in the glare of the Mediterranean sun is notable. Instead, the focus here is on material traces. These are found boats, actual vestiges of the perilous crossing from North Africa to Europe, metonyms of mass migration. And yet, their image is also calming, visually seductive. Despite the inherent ethical weight, the way the objects pictured pull us into relation with the uneasy lives and deaths of other people, of refugees, the image is easy to look at. Particularly chilling in this regard is the harsh brightness of the midday sun as it casts an unyielding light across everything in its sights. I'm struck immediately by the proposition embedded in the title: Sculpture for the New Millennium. Shipwreck, Sculpture for the New Millennium. What does it mean to think of this as sculpture? And more loaded still, to see it as a vital form for the new millennium. The title signals so much so succinctly, pointing to wreckage not simply as a memorial to trauma, but more in the vein of Walter Benjamin's melancholic angel of history. The pileup of shipwrecks propels us backwards into the future. The sculptural here comes to us as already in existence rather than hewed into being, not built up or abstracted from materials, but rather found abandoned in disrepair. And notably in this instance, the form before us arrives via the inherent distance and remove from the real granted by the photograph. Writing at a moment of intense crisis at the outset of the Second World War, Benjamin's words from the Theses on the Philosophy of History bear particular relevance here, especially as he refers to wreckage and storms. Where we perceive a chain of events, Angelus Novus sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such a violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned. While the pile of debris before him grows skyward, this storm, is what we call progress. The still image, Shipwreck, Sculpture for the New Millennium, is taken from Julian's critically acclaimed film, Western Union Small Boats, shot on 35mm and transferred to video, which was first screened at the Venice Film Festival in 2007. The film is a large-scale, lyrical, and visceral meditation, a lush and sensual cinematic experience that has been exhibited in numerous iterations around the world, with as many as 5 screens in an installation and as few as 1, or indeed pared down to these photographic stills, isolated and exhibited within their own light boxes. Shot on the Sicilian island of Lampedusa an infamous destination for those who cross the Mediterranean from North Africa, the film is a testament to the ways Julian, a Londoner of Caribbean descent, has remained committed to engaging with diaspora and the legacies of slavery and colonialism. It is in part a response to Western media accounts of trans-Mediterranean migration and migrant death at sea, as well as a poetic attempt to rethink representations of migration in the context of large-scale global displacement, rising nationalism, and the prevalence of violent bordering practices across Europe and the United States in particular. Shot predominantly within the opulent 18th century palazzo Valguarnera Gangi, featured in Luchino Visconti's 1963 film The Leopard, Julian's film unfolds as a highly choreographed hallucinatory sequence. Among the many layered allusions to transformation within the narrative, we might recall that Visconti was an aristocrat who became a Marxist. The film consists of a montage of moments. The undulating lines of Baroque architecture in the stairwell emulate the waves of the sea as bodies writhe, roll, and thrash. At other moments, we see suntanned bathers relaxing on the beach, a tank top washes the shore, and nearby, bodies covered in bright mylar blankets lie on the sand in a line unmoving. Ominously, we hear the creaking of masts, a murmuring voice, the distant repeated sound of a scream. The images in this montage have become customary in the wide circulation of media motifs of precarious migration, but what does it mean to see them within the context of art? The metonym of the small boats becomes the stand-in for larger connoted narratives that are conveyed to some extent, yet ultimately remain elusive and obscure. While Western Union small boats speaks to aspects of migration, both through historic allusion and experiential sensations, crisis is likely not the first descriptor to come to mind. Though the film immerses viewers as witnesses within its sequences, watching lithe bodies twisting and tumbling down a set of stairs and struggling as if drowning beneath the surface of water, the grace of these movements, like a dance, is captivating to watch. They put the viewer at ease and in awe more so than conveying a sense of urgency or emergency. Neither the small boats referenced in the title nor the seafaring migrants who precariously are adrift appear for long. In Emma Chubb's succinct summation, with a total of just over 3 minutes of on-screen time, the boats and passengers seem like nothing more than a whiff of current geopolitical events in an otherwise pleasurable white cube gallery experience. And so I return to the complex proposal aboard Shipwreck, Sculpture for the New Millennium, an image that shares much in common with Wolfgang Tillmann's Lampedusa of 2008, a coincidence I'm still thinking through. Are these works of art echoes of actual life and strife, critique, reportage, or ineffective affirmations of things as they are? Do these abandoned objects, the fragile boats, become symbols of fragile bodies, precarious life? Within the formal world of Julian's film, this is a credible connection. When I made the work, the artist explained in a recent interview, Africans were the ones crossing the Mediterranean. But in a prophetic sense, I saw that in the future, they, migrants, could be anybody. But what relation to the realities of migration does the work of art actually invite us into here? Julian is one of many artists who've made artwork that speaks of and to migrant passages, while also making a claim for sculpture's role in this ethico-political crisis. Controversial recent examples include Christophe Bluchel's display of Barca Nostra, the actual wreck of a fishing boat that sank in the Mediterranean in April 2015, drowning some 1,100 migrants who had undertaken the journey from Libya to Italy within its hold. Installed at the 2019 edition of the Venice Biennale, it's hard to say whether this is a monument to the dead, an indictment of disparity, or a reprehensible aestheticization of violence and trauma against displaced peoples. Other artists, including Vic Muniz, Calliope Lemos, Adela Bessemed, to name only a few, have also made sculptural work within the matrix of and with the materials of migration, and have each been met with varying degrees of criticism, praise, and reprehension. These artworks flow into a conspicuous migratory turn in contemporary art, joining a flood of artworks that evoke mass human migration as both subject matter and approach. And I think we can understand the migratory turn in contemporary art also as being connected to the increasingly prominent pressures placed on institutions to question the influence of colonialism, of racism, on both people and material cultures, as well as on the methods of classification and display, and critically, the museum's own role in the displacement and eradication of Indigenous communities. And yet, despite the complex and loaded ethico-political stakes of the subject of migration, in most cases, the aesthetic dimension of the work of art overrides the potential poignancy of empathetic engagement and political mobilization. This paradox begs the question, can contemporary art respond to the harrowing migration of people in ways that are powerful beyond the scope of the museum or gallery? And what role can sculpture in particular play in this dynamic? Looking at recent art practices, my talk today considers artworks that engage with ambiguity while proposing ways to understand and potentially challenge geopolitical disparities in the present. In particular, I want to talk about works that stage issues of displacement, dispossession, and salvage or repair. My project investigates how contemporary sculpture navigates the tides of materiality and migratory aesthetics in tandem, considering work by a wide-ranging group of international artists, including Xaviera Simmons, Francis Alice, Kader Attia, Olu Ogibe, and others. For each of these artists, the boat has served as an iconic sign and key metaphor for migration, and yet the question remains. Within the context of arts, can boats evoke something more specific still? What role has the shipwreck come to play in the cultural imaginary? In taking up the actual material vestiges of human crossings, many of these artworks emphasize an attempt to make the situation real for viewers. Importantly, the question is then, does the reiteration of these scenes and materials help us to recognize migration as a condition of and a reality of global interdependence, and moreover to realize the ways we are each implicated, how our fates are entwined, the ways we are indeed all in the same boat? How are we as viewers interpolated by these works, and what are the risks of reinstating the callous viewing conditions circulated in Western media representation, as seen here, in which affectless beachgoers do little more than casually observe? Migration is an urgent subject in contemporary life. In 2015, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees estimated that 1,005,504 migrants and refugees arrived in Europe alone, coming from Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq, among other places. More recently, the UN has reported that the global number of displaced people in the world currently exceeds 70.8 million, including people fleeing various forms of persecution, war, and violence. In correlation to this rise, throughout the last decade and a half, an ever-growing number of international artists have developed artworks that engage the displacement and movements of people, whether voluntary or not. Critical evaluation of these works through the lens of art history, visual culture, and sculptural practice is largely absent. Though some of the artworks that engage with mass migration are poignant and arguably activist, others are intensely problematic. A consideration of the changing meanings and expectations of sculpture in this context is also necessary, one that examines sculpture as a splintered and splintery category, replete with conceptual conceits, the traces of process and transit, questions of exhibition, the ethics of engagement, and the life of material. In her groundbreaking essay, Passages in Modern Sculpture from 1977, art historian Rosalind Krauss argued that an emphasis on process and flux were central to defining emergent practices in modern sculpture. I believe this criterion remains true. However, I would add that as art practice has been galvanized by prescient allusions to social and geopolitical debates, the flux resides not simply in the material of sculpture, but moreover in the complex instability of evoked meanings and their critical relationships to viewers. Considering sculpture as a practice of spatial relations opens on to the possibility of incorporating an analysis of global migration within its scope as a central aspect of contemporary spatial dynamics. Recent high-profile international exhibitions have attempted to incorporate this dimension, and these include Streamline's Ocean, Global Trade and Migration at the Dichterhallen in Hamburg in 2015, the Museum of Latin American Art's Relational Undercurrents, Contemporary Art of the Caribbean Archipelago from 2017, ICA Boston's When Home Won't Let You Stay, Migration Through Contemporary Art 2019, and The Warmth of Other Suns, Stories of Displacement at the Phillips Collection in 2019, to name only a few. Each of these highlighted diaspora, frequently but not exclusively using sculpture, in ways that highlight the effective and material traces of current and historic migration events. In many of the artworks included, objects stand in for human present. Here I'm referring not simply to practices like Mona Hatoum's, in which uncanny anthropomorphism takes place. Rather, I'm thinking more about artistic projects that incorporate or rely on materials and objects that have had living contact with actual migrants and refugees, which are deployed within the space of art and exhibition. These vernacular found objects differ greatly from the tradition of the Duchampian ready-made, and yet, like the ready-made, it is worth scrutinizing how the act of exhibition, how the shift in context affects the ultimate meaning of the piece, particularly because of the vulnerable and often tragic realities of migrants and refugees who previously embodied or engaged with these materials. Salvaging forensic objects and materials in this context raises crucial ethical dimensions. A collection of found images documenting the passage of migrants by sea forms Xaviera Simmons' Super Unknown, Alive in the, from 2010. Displayed in a grid, these 40 photographs, appropriated from newspapers and the internet, show what the artist has referred to as in-between spaces of migratory histories. We see a disparate series of claustrophobic, tightly cropped, poor resolution photos of people crammed into boats, precisely the opposite of the quality of Julian's stills. These are leveled in scale, and the space within each respective image brings to mind one of the central paradoxes of migrancy as a contemporary condition, namely, that it is predicated mutually on the tension between the opposing poles of confinement and mobility, being trapped within a tight frame at the very moment of movement. Precarity is sewn into Simmons' subtitle, Alive in the what? In the picture, perhaps? Does this imply that in one sense we are to understand these photographs of migrants overcrowded within small boats as evidence of their living status, as in, look, they're alive in the photograph? But what happened next after this document was made? The answer is, of course, super unknown. Unknown as that information is as lost as the image is appropriated, dislodged and displaced from its original context, and unknown in face of the depths of the deep blue sea and the fate of those pictured if and when they come ashore, reaching the border they seek to cross. Unknown in the troubling anonymity of the people pictured. Simmons's combination of multiple images extracted from multiple contexts both collapses their difference and amplifies it. The identities of the migrants are anchored together even as they remain in their own boats. Here, the semblance between their situations cuts in both directions. Together, they form a collective convoy, even as they and their plights become absorbed within one another. And they are not alone, either within or without the photograph, since the very existence of the images speaks to the existence of someone else, namely the photographer on the outside of the frame. In this way, the industry of photojournalism and the intensive migration and circulation of such images globally is also brought into question. The following year, Simmons exhibited two new and related photographs, and these are in fact the ones I want to concentrate on here, titled On Sculpture 1 and On Sculpture 2. As with Julian's Shipwreck, Sculpture for a New Millennium, I am drawn in first by the enigma of the sculptural illusion presented in photographic form. In On Sculpture 1, the bodies of glistening, naked, multiracial models are glimpsed across the fanned-out pages of an open book, obstructing the chipped painted letters on the side of a boat. Imaginably, they are blocking an A, positioned between the visible M and R, and perhaps the word beneath is some form of mare, or water. Is this a visual pun about bodies on boats? The photo is enigmatic and strange. In one sense, it seems to be about dislocation and relations in space between people and things, between materials and representations. Simmons has stated previously that she conceives of portrait and landscape as interchangeable terms, and I wonder how this orientation inflects her work formally and ideologically. I detect a pull in each of the on-sculpture photos between the verticality of portraiture and the horizontality of landscape. I turn to sculpture on Sculpture 2 in an attempt to grasp more. The background scene appears tranquil yet vibrant, with gradations of indigo, turquoise, and aqua moving towards the viewer, from the sky down through the water and rhyming with the series of looping bracelets on the arm of the Black protagonist we see here holding a black and white picture within the frame, whose jagged baseline indicates it was torn from a print magazine. The image within the image shows more than a dozen bodies imprudently leaping and diving off a small boat in unison. Why are they jumping overboard? Is it an act of desperation, or might shore be in sight? In the upper left-hand corner of the page, we read the word backstage. How can we make sense of this? Again, we are presented with a deeply ambivalent image. I think of Saloni Mather's admittance of the deep ambivalence and indeterminacy of the paradigm of the migrant, when she explains that, and I quote, "It represents some of the most difficult forms of entanglement and separation resulting from our collective condition," end quote. In this way, we might consider Simmons's sculptural proposal as a kind of analogy. Notice how the figure in the photograph holds the image up in such a way that it lines up with the actual horizon. Is this kind of relational realignment the stuff of sculpture? I think too of the alternative epistemology offered by Edouard Glissant, who argued for the transformation of impermeable border walls into points of passage. Informed foremost by the Caribbean landscape, Glissant described how it would be impossible to convincingly define the borders separating the individual islands making up the Caribbean archipelago, because their borderlines would always shift with the waves of the ocean. In a drawing entitled L'archipel est une passage et non pas un mur, the archipelago is a passage and not a wall, Glissant illustrates this view by placing several islands of the archipelago in such a way that their borders overlap at several points and are drawn with multiple wavy, uncertain lines. Imagined meetings on the horizon are also integral to the Belgian-born, Mexico-based artist Francis Alice's recurrent preoccupation with disparity and displacement, as he determinedly seeks out emancipatory actions in view of uneven geographies. As a project for Insight 1997, Alice performed the loop, traversing from Tijuana, Mexico to San Diego, California, without crossing the US-Mexico border. Instead, Alice literally took the long way around, heading south through Panama and Chile, before crossing over to Australia, up through Singapore to Korea, over to Alaska, before moving down through Canada and the US. By circumnavigating the globe, Alice allegorically evaded the fraught geopolitics of border passage. even while he nevertheless highlighted the privileged capacity of movement for the few, especially within the bounds of the so-called art world, which has been only increasingly orchestrated based on access and mobility within the circuits and circuses of international exhibitions. The artist's deliberate avoidance of one border brought many other borders into dialogue, casting a much wider net of implications and suggesting how unavoidably the one affects the many. 8 years later in Lima, Peru, Alice's When Faith Moves Mountains again engage with logistics and logics of boundaries and displacement, this time summoning deep allusions to the power of an idea and, if not an actual act. In this case, in what Alice has described as a social allegory and his attempt to de-romanticize land art, 500 volunteers joined together with shovels in hand, lined up single file across the sand dune, and dug systematically all day long in the blazing hot sun in an effort to relocate the sand by a few inches. Documented by video, this endurance event oscillates between poetry and politics, especially given the geographic results of this exhausting action that were itself transitory. Driven by the principle of maximum effort, minimal result, this massive collective labor affected only a minimal, ephemeral spatial change, and yet, as the title implies, When Faith Moves Mountains continues to live on as a capacious legend of art practice, collectivity, and the distribution of the sensible. On August 8, 2008, Alice set the piece Don't Cross the Bridge Before You Get to the River in motion, documented by a 7-minute, 46-second video. A line of kids on the beach in Tangiers, Morocco, carrying handmade shoe boats enters the water, walking towards Europe. Simultaneously, another row of children, also carrying handmade shoe boats, walks into the sea, headed towards Tarifa, Spain. Even the premise of the piece sounds riddle-like. In effect, the performance functions as a social allegory, concerned with the fluidity of borders. The space is opened by imaginative acts. The passage of the children conjures the building of a bridge across the 7.7 miles of the Strait of Gibraltar, with the two groups meeting in the middle. And though this is never entirely manifest, ultimately impossible, at varying moments in the film's two-screen edit, we have the illusions that the two lines of boats actually meet on the horizon. But this falls apart quickly and is washed away by turbulent sea. It is nerve-wracking to watch these young bodies pushing against the waves. After all, how far can a person walk forward through oncoming waves? The meager height of the children only magnifies the possibility of their being engulfed. When does the playfulness of the event become perilous? The splashing waves are first met with the sounds of the children's voices, laughing, joyful, excited, as they walk in a single file into the sea. But as the impact of the waves continues to mount, more than simply rhythmic, the waves quickly create an atmosphere of incessant pounding. The waves splash over the camera's lens, and thus virtually over the viewer, obstructing their clarity of vision. The waves simultaneously and incessantly cover the heads of the children, who, as they come up for air, continue to venture forward. Submerged, the double screens swiftly bring on a feeling of nausea, of seasickness, of claustrophobia, of entrapment in face of the all-encompassing expanse of water, choppy and frothing. Sound drowns out. We see bodies underwater, feet kicking, paddling movements, bubbles floating frantically towards the surface. Somewhere around 1 minute and 39 seconds, the words, "the Strait of Gibraltar," appear in white across the center of the screen, in Spanish and Arabic, with English subtitles in yellow. And from here, briefly, the children are gone. Only tossed water, bits of seaweed, gurgling waves, and sunlight occasionally pierce the water. The accompanying text then continues. 7.7 nautical miles wide, 13 kilometers separates Europe from Africa. If a line of kids leaves Europe towards Morocco and a line of kids leaves Africa towards Spain, will the two lines meet in the chimera of the horizon? And then another line begins from Tarifa, Spain, and Tangier, Morocco, August 12th, 2008. The mention of the chimera raises the specter of Greek mythology and of a hybrid creature implausibly composed of the disparate parts of more than one animal. This seems to bear some relevance to the impossibility of the passage underway, but also to the coming together of parts and people witnessed in this poetic and politically charged fable. The viewing experience is at times touching, but mostly trepidatious. In a near kaleidoscope of dizzying perspectives, the camera moves from aerial views to underwater footage, close-ups of the flip-flop boats to sloshing water. Uneven horizon lines tilt and tip before the sequence begins anew, with new lines of walking children entering the sea from the sandy beach in a loop, boats in hand. Somewhere around 3 minutes and 50 seconds, we have the close-up of a lost flip-flop boat. And at 4 minutes and 27 seconds, a smiling kid appears from beneath the water, triumphantly reclaiming his boat. Later, the video closes with a view from below, looking up through the water, featuring a lone, floating shoeboat dappled by the sun's rays. The central sculptural aspect of this piece is the shoeboats. These makeshift vessels are constructed out of used flip-flops and Moroccan babouche slippers. The fact that they have been worn by feet is an integral element to the project, in part because layering in the appropriation of ordinary materials from the stream of everyday life adds an additional visceral dimension. They retain the traces of life lived, distance traveled. It also incorporates the conceptual suggestion of walking in someone else's shoes and implicates the culture of excess consumerism and waste. I'll mention here that the BBC recently reported that some 90 tons of flip-flops are thrown away every year, many of which, of course, end up in the oceans and washed up on beaches. The fact of using single, unpaired shoes is significant as well. One almost wants to imagine they will be reunited with their match somehow on the other side. Elise is, of course, not the first artist to recycle flip-flops as part of art or as allusions to embodiment. Think, for example, of the anthropomorphic work of the Benin artist Romuald Hamouzet, whose art is included in the HMI's portable sculpture exhibition. When the video for Don't Cross the Bridge Before You Get to the River is shown in a gallery, the weathered shoeboats are frequently exhibited as well. Yet another installation of the actual vestiges of migration within the space of art. They are set against a square mirror along the floor in a manner that might recall Robert Smithson's exploration of non-sites with his mirror travels or mirror displacements of the late 1960s. In Alice's work, the mirror similarly extends the series of boats endlessly into space, furthering their reach, while also calling the viewer into a more complicit and necessarily reflective relation to the piece. The art of Kader Attia is likewise one of relationality, conceiving of ways to see people and things in meaningful proximity to one another. Like Elise, Attia recalls the embodied lives of anonymous migrants by incorporating worn materials into his work. For his La Mer Morte, the Dead Sea, first installed in 2015, a spectrum of used blue clothing is strewn across the gallery floor in a manner that imitates the rise and fall of waves, emulating a body of water while making allusions to death and bodies washed ashore. These discarded garments, emptied of bodies, also become modest monuments to the many people who've been depersonalized by the media as a threatening wave themselves, the wave of migration. Moreover, Attia's use of actual used materials, taking them out of mass circulation, can be productively thought of as an instance of what the artist calls re-appropriation, a creative reversal of the powerful system of appropriation that is Western universalism. Attia's series of photographs entitled Rocher Carré are often exhibited alongside La Mer Morte, and I'd like to turn to them now. On first encounter, the scene appears nearly extraterrestrial, some sort of post-minimalist expanded field sculpture, again, reminiscent of Smithson. What we are looking at is somewhat surprisingly found materials. We see the shoreline of a beach in the impoverished Bab al-Oued neighborhood of Algiers, in which the government has installed huge concrete blocks, some between 3 and 4 feet high, as obstructive deterrents to anyone considering a voyage by sea. From this vantage, young people regularly spend time watching ships sail between continents in the distance. Attia has captured images of the blocks unoccupied, as well as with wistful youths among them. Born and raised outside of Paris in an Algerian Muslim family, for Attia, these forms are also reminiscent of the concrete populated, segregated banlieues. These despondent photographs are about restrictive space, borders, and the limits of movement. The glare of light shares much in common with Julian's shipwreck sculpture for the new millennium, which we saw at the outset. And like Elise's Don't Cross the Bridge video, this too is a narrative about an impossible crossing. Each photograph is impounded within a light box, physically echoing the Rocher Carré themselves. Spending time with these sculptural images, illusions proliferate, including a handful which seem to intersect the melancholic paintings of Casper David Friedrich, who Casper is misspelled here, P-A-R, such as his famed Wreck of Hope, 1823-1824, also known as The Sea of Ice, a work in part inspired by the polar expedition gone awry in search of the Northwest Passage in the Arctic Ocean in 1819. We see the stern of the shipwreck on the right-hand side, dwarfed by shards of iceberg. Both works structurally negotiate a study of near and distant forms by aesthetic means. The figures in Attia become pseudo-references to 2 other works by Friedrich, namely The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog and Sunset Brothers, established icons of pensiveness and sublimity in Western art. It is curious to rethink Romanticism transposed to the context of North Africa in this way. Manthia Diawara has argued eloquently for seeing Rocher Carré as poetic propositions in the sense of Glissant's writings, envisioning them as statements about politics, resistance, and the possibilities of reparation. According to Diawara, Attia's mode of relationality cannot be understood without recalling Europe's debt to Africa, the unpaid balances of the Atlantic slave trade, colonialism, and the continuing decimation of indigenous populations and their environments through mining and wars. Recast in this way, to put it in Glissant's terms, the youth looking out at the water in Algiers create relations with other people in other places, confronted by nationalism, incarceration, anti-immigration laws, discrimination, and barriers to boundary crossings of all kinds, places including but not limited to Lampedusa, Palestine, and the border between US and Mexico. Glissant conceived such connections as phenomena that may or may not be immediately perceived or apprehended, but that will nevertheless make themselves felt. I'd like to close with one final example. Like Isaac Julian at the outset, Olu Ogibe's work proposes a futurity of sculpture in a form not immediately recognizable as sculpture. Whereas Julian employed photography to picture sculpture for the new millennium, Ogibe brings language specifically into the conversation. For Ogibe's new monument series, he painted by hand in English and Italian the same phrase from the Gospel of Matthew, and you see it here in black. I was a stranger and you took me in. And we see it here in German, English, and Italian. Dedicated to Domenico Mimmo Lucano, former mayor of the southern Italian town of Riace, who received death threats and criminal charges for welcoming and integrating migrants into the life of his town. The German ship captain Carola Rackete, who was arrested docking vessels carrying migrants without authorization in Lampedusa. And the aid worker Scott Warren, who was tried for the US government for providing water, food, first aid, and shelter to migrants making the trek across the deadly Sonoran Desert. Each of these figures stand out for their hospitality to migrants. And in this way, Ogibe's work plays into ongoing debates on monuments by honoring humanitarian efforts, particularly those who have received severe state-sanctioned backlash for doing so. These monuments are sometimes shown in partnership in museums with the EU Venta 2020, which you see at the bottom, a relic Kisby ring dedicated to the young Europeans who captained their own humanitarian rescue boat in the Mediterranean Sea 2015 and 2016, saving more than 14,000 migrants before being criminalized by the Italian government. In the work of Julian, Simmons, Alice, Attia, Ogibe, and others, to varying degrees, we see entities of art and sculpture complicated by mobility and rationality, by means that are indeterminate. They remind us that decolonization is also necessarily an act of unfixing established dominant meanings. Advocating for an openness to the migration of meaning and people, let's recall that, again, that for Glissant, the poetics of relation is that which relates, links, and relays the relationship between all the differences that are possible, visible and invisible, in the tout monde. Glissant argues that the only way to go beyond the boundaries set by binary oppositions is to recognize our differences that are vital and which hold together the tissue of the world into one. To say then that we are all in the same boat in this context is not a statement either of universality or equality. Indeed, it is rather the recognition of deep inequity and disequilibrium, and to say, in any case, our fates are inextricable. It is a call to acknowledge the relationality that underscores all migration, forced or voluntary, and furthermore, to understand the fickleness of precarity, the ways in which the position of the migrant may one day be your own as you search the horizon for ways to stay afloat.